No one warned you because if they had, you might have hesitated. You might have slowed down. You might have asked questions that make people uncomfortable. So instead, they talked about numbers, percentages, rates, monthly payments. They explained everything that sounds responsible and almost nothing that feels real once you're living inside the decision. This cost doesn't show up on paper. That's why it's easy to ignore at first. It doesn't arrive as a bill. It arrives as a feeling, a quiet tension you can't quite explain, a sense that something is pulling from you every month. Even when the math says everything is fine, most Americans think the real cost of big financial decisions is money. That's what everyone prepares you for. But money is the easiest part to measure. The harder costs are invisible, and because they're invisible, they're rarely discussed honestly. This cost shows up in how you make choices and what you say yes to and what you avoid. It shows up in the way risk starts to feel threatening instead of exciting, in the way you plan your life around obligations instead of possibilities. Nobody warns you that some decisions quietly tax your freedom. Long before they affect your bank account, you feel it when opportunities come up and your first reaction isn't curiosity, but calculation. Not do I want this, but can I afford to disrupt what I've built? The dangerous part is that this cost doesn't feel dramatic. It feels responsible. You tell yourself this is just adulthood, that everyone feels this pressure, that this is the price of stability. And because everyone around you seems to accept it, you assume that discomfort is normal. What no one explains is that there is a difference between responsibility and restriction. Responsibility should give you confidence. Restriction quietly drains it. When a decision starts limiting your ability to adapt, explore, or breathe, it stops being neutral and starts becoming expensive in ways you weren't taught to measure. This cost often appears as mental noise, constant low-level stress, running scenarios in your head late at night, thinking about worst cases you never used to think about, not because you're pessimistic, but because the margin for error feels thin. People are warned about interest rates, but not about interest on attention. How much mental energy long-term obligations quietly consume. How often they pull you out of the present and in the future worry. That cost compounds just like money does. And because this cost isn't acknowledged, people internalize it. They assume they're doing something wrong, that they should be happier, more grateful, more confident. So instead of questioning the structure, they question themselves. This is how financial shame is born, not from failure, but from unspoken trade-offs. You're told you're winning, but you don't feel like it. That disconnect eats away at trust in your own judgment. If everything looks good on paper but feels heavy in reality, you start doubting your instincts. Another reason no one warns you about this cost is because it doesn't hit immediately. It creeps in over time, after the excitement fades, after the routine settles, after the decision becomes part of your identity. By then, questioning it feels risky. People talk about sacrifice as if it's always noble, but not all sacrifices are equal. Some sacrifices buy you something meaningful, others just maintain appearances. The cost no one warned you about is how often people sacrifice flexibility to protect an image of success. You feel this cost when you realize how much of your life depends on everything going right. When a single disruption feels threatening, when you notice you've become more cautious, not because you've grown wiser, but because the downside feels unforgiving. This is why so many people feel anxious even during good years. The system works when conditions are perfect, but life isn't perfect, and when your setup requires perfection to function, the stress never fully leaves. The cost also shows up socially, in conversations you avoid, in advice you hesitate to give because it might contradict the path you chose. When you defend decisions not because they feel right, but because you've committed to them publicly. No one warns you that once a decision becomes part of who you are, it's harder to examine honestly. You protect it instinctively, not because it's perfect, but because it represents you. This cost doesn't mean the decision was wrong. It means it was incomplete. It accounted for money, but not for life, for spreadsheets, but not for change, for today's version of you, but not tomorrow's. And the most frustrating part is that many people sense this cost early on, but don't have language for it. They feel ungrateful for questioning something they were told to want, so they push the feeling down and keep going. That's why this cost is so powerful. It stays hidden until people are deep enough, and that naming it feels dangerous, but the cost exists whether it's named or not. What makes this cost so hard to deal with is that it doesn't announce itself. It blends into daily life. It hides inside routines that look normal from the outside. You're busy. You're functioning. Bills are paid. Nothing is technically wrong. And yet, something feels off. This is the cost of constant vigilance, of always needing things to stay stable. When your life is built on long-term obligations, your nervous system never fully relaxes. Even during calm periods, there's an underlying alertness, a sense that you're one unexpected event away from stress. The tension becomes background noise, but it still drains you. No one warns you that this kind of setup trains your brain to think defensively. You stop asking expansive questions. You start asking protective ones. How do I keep this from falling apart? Instead of what would actually make my life better. Over time, that shift changes who you become. This cost also shows up in how you relate to time. The future starts feeling crowded, already spoken for. You're not planning possibilities anymore. You're managing obligations. Even exciting ideas come with an asterisk. That sounds nice, but gets heavier every year. People assume stress comes from lack of money. Often, it comes from lack of margin. When your life has no buffer, everything feels urgent. You can't absorb shocks. You can only react to them. That's exhausting, and it has nothing to do with how smart or disciplined you are. Another hidden cost is how this pressure affects self-trust. When you feel uneasy but can't explain why, you start dismissing your own instincts. You tell yourself you're overthinking, that you should be grateful, that this is just how things work. Slowly, you lose confidence in your ability to judge what's right for you. This is especially dangerous because it keeps people stuck longer than necessary. They sense the cost, but they don't trust the signal, so they wait. They hope it will fade. They assume the discomfort is temporary. Meanwhile, the structure stays the same. The cost also shows up in how people talk about money. Conversations become shallow or defensive. You either avoid the topic or reduce it to surface-level advice. No one wants to admit that something they worked hard for feels heavy, so everyone pretends it's fine. This creates a strange collective silence. Millions of people carrying similar pressure, all assuming they're the only ones who feel it. That silence protects the system, not the individuals inside it. Another part no one warns you about is how this cost affects ambition, not motivation. But ambition, you stop dreaming in bold terms. You dream in safe ones. You aim for comfort, not alignment. And when ambition shrinks, people mistake it for maturity. But there's a difference between growing up and giving up. Optionality. Maturity should expand your understanding, not narrow your imagination. When a system rewards conformity over adaptability, people slowly lose touch with what they actually want. This cost doesn't explode. It erodes. It shows up in small compromises that feel harmless on their own. Staying in a job a little longer than you want, delaying a move indefinitely, saying no to opportunities that feel inconvenient rather than impossible. Over time, those small compromises add up to a life that feels smaller than it needs to be. Not because you aimed low, but because you were optimizing for stability without realizing how expensive that optimization would become. People often ask why they feel tired even when nothing major is wrong. This is why. The cost is cumulative. It's the energy spent maintaining alignment with decisions that no longer fully match who you are. And because this cost doesn't come with a warning label, people assume it's unavoidable. They stop imagining alternatives. They tell themselves this is the price everyone pays. That freedom is for someone else, someone luckier, someone richer, someone braver. But the truth is, Many people aren't lacking courage or discipline. They're lacking clarity. They made decisions with incomplete information, not because they were careless, but because the most important costs were never discussed. The system doesn't warn you about this cost because it doesn't benefit from you noticing it. Awareness creates friction, and friction slows momentum. So instead, the focus stays on numbers, not on how your life actually feels once the decision is behind you. And by the time most people realize what this cost really is, they've already normalized it. They call it stress. They call it adulthood. They call it responsibility. They don't call it what it actually is. The moment you finally recognize this cost, it stops feeling mysterious. You realize it was never about being weak, ungrateful, or bad with money. It was about being asked to commit without being told the full price. And once you see that, the weight shifts from self-blame to understanding. This cost isn't proof that you failed. It's proof that the decision was framed. And completely, you were shown the math, but not the consequences. You were taught how to afford it, not how to live inside it. That gap is where most people get stuck. What brings relief isn't undoing everything overnight. It's reclaiming awareness. When you understand what's actually draining you, you regain choice. You can start making adjustments instead of just enduring. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What needs to change?" The biggest mistake people make at this stage is thinking the only solution is extreme. Sell everything, quit everything, start over. That kind of thinking keeps people frozen. The real leverage comes from smaller, quieter shifts, from adding margin, from reducing fragility, from questioning assumptions you inherited but never consciously chose. This cost loses power when you stop defending past decisions and start designing forward ones. You don't need to justify the path you took. You need to decide how much control you want going forward. The future doesn't owe loyalty to your past choices. One of the most important realizations is that not all costs are unavoidable. Some are optional, but only if you're aware of them. Stress that comes from growth is different from stress that comes from constraint. One expands you, the other slowly wears you down. The reason this cost feels so heavy is because it accumulates silently. But the moment you stop feeding it with denial, it begins to shrink. Awareness interrupts the cycle. It gives you permission to question, to adjust, to choose differently without needing a dramatic justification. Freedom doesn't arrive as a sudden breakthrough. It arrives as breathing room, as options, as the ability to absorb change without panic. And that starts when you design your life to tolerate uncertainty instead of fearing it. This is where financial conversations usually get it wrong. They focus on optimization instead of resilience, on maximizing instead of stabilizing, on looking successful instead of feeling secure. But real security isn't about how much you have. It's about how much pressure your life can handle without breaking. The cost no one warned you about is that many smart decisions quietly reduce your tolerance for change. They make your life efficient, but fragile, and fragility is expensive, even when everything looks fine. Once you understand this, your priorities begin to shift naturally. You start valuing liquidity over leverage, flexibility over appearances, simplicity over complexity, not because you're afraid, but because you're paying attention. And if you haven't made the decision yet, this awareness is even more valuable. It doesn't mean you should avoid commitment. It means you should enter it with eyes open, asking not just, "Can I afford this?" but "How much of my future does this quietly pre-decide?" Because every long-term decision isn't just a financial one. It's a lifestyle agreement. It decides how adaptable you'll be, how much room you'll have to breathe, how easily you can change direction when life inevitably changes first. The uncomfortable truth is that many people don't need more income to feel better. They need fewer invisible drains. They need structures that support them instead of constantly demanding protection. Once you see this cost clearly, it stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you can manage. You start designing for resilience instead of perfection, for margin instead of maximum output, And that's where things finally feel lighter, not because life gets easier, but because your decisions stop working against you in silence. No one warned you about this cost, but now that you can see it, you're no longer paying it blindly.